Hey there, fellow filmmakers. We are back this week and we are talking about how to boffin out with your gear.
It is so important. I remember, working with cinematographers early in my career before I started shooting. And, they would jokingly say, I took the camera to bed with me last night. And the thing is, you really do need to know your gear pretty intimately to get the most out of it. I've also been in situations, vividly remember being out on a really time-sensitive shoot in Fiji, and flying in a camera that none of the camera crew had used before. And there were about 5 camera operators on that crew. And how long it took them to come up to speed because the buttons were in a slightly different place. They didn't quite know what the presets were. And we lost so much time and money by doing that, even though it was a better camera than any of the other cameras we had on that shoot. So knowing what your gear can do and how to best use it for the story you're telling ahead of time is what we're talking about, because we're still in pre-production phase and it is absolutely worth the time and effort to get to know your equipment, even if you're renting it. So even if it's going to mean that you have to take an extra rental day or 2 out to really familiarise yourself with it, absolutely worthwhile. It'll save you money in the end.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it's a lot to do. I mean, when I first doing the filming for myself, I used to just grab a camera and go down to the local park for a couple of hours and just practice all the different functions on the camera, different ways to, use the different settings, and just really got familiar with it. I think using it as often as you can is just the best way to get to know your gear.
I think it's kind of a lifelong exercise. Even just before we did this shoot today, our microphones were playing up. You're always learning something new, familiarising yourself with the gear. Modern equipment has so much functionality. It is hard to master it or find the time to master it all at once. So sometimes it is an iterative process, but the more you can sponge up and learn about what your equipment can do, the better your storytelling will be.
And it's not just the camera gear you need to get to know, it's also the sound and the lighting gear. And learning how to use lights effectively is a really great skill. So I think anytime you can get into a studio type space and just play around with setups, play around with how the lighting works, that's a real advantage too.
Yeah, this is going to take some time, and some of it you'll learn, maybe you've been learning already and you have some of those skills and some of that theoretical knowledge, which is really useful. But we're all here making documentary films, and the thing about that is we need to be really adaptable. Things go wrong in the field. Often we're in uncontrolled environments. Often the way you'd like to light a scene is not what you can do because of the practicalities of the space you work in. So you're going to be learning all different ways to work with your gear, and probably most importantly, work with it quickly. And this is where I think what you're packing down into becomes really important. How long cameras and other gear takes to actually get out of its box and assemble is going to be a critical part of what you're doing as well. And we'll show you an example here, but there's some absolutely brilliant camera cases which just can hold an amazing amount of gear and pack down really small, but are really functional and kind of getting up and running really quickly.
Yeah, and the biggest thing I think that's been revolutionary for us, and I think it's because technology's moved along as well, is having wheels on the gear that you're taking out whenever possible. Having a tripod bag that's got wheels on it, having a camera bag with wheels on it. It's getting a lot easier now because they're designing so many really, really good products, but that wasn't always the case. We've been stuck in New York with a case for a camera that was almost the size of a coffin, trying to get it in and out of taxis, and it was a bit of a disaster, really. But we have the story to tell.
So I think that's so true. You've only got 2 hands. There's only so much gear you can actually carry if you're slinging something over your shoulder and you've got 2 hands. If you've got a dedicated Pelican case, for example, for every bit of gear because you want to protect it as much as possible, that's going to mean a lot of trips back and forth from the vehicle, the Uber, your car, however you're getting to the shoot, and you're going to lose time. So the more you can pack gear down into a more compressed case and be able to break it out quickly, the better it works. And there's no greater compliment for me than when we show up to a location with a couple of bags and spring out 3 tripods, 3 cameras, 2 lights, a microphone stand, and the participants are just like, my God, it's like a TV studio, and you set that up in 10 minutes. That's the impression it leaves on them. But I think that's a really critical principle to have in your mind as a documentary filmmaker.
Yeah, it's how do you be nimble and effective with your gear and move it around and be able to achieve what you need to achieve with what you've got.
Yeah, so we're talking about the gear we need. So let's go through some of the fundamentals of what need to be tested ahead of time. So I think maybe we should start with the often overlooked area of sound recording. So I think it's absolutely critical. In terms of the minimum amount of sound recording gear you need to have in your kit, what would you say it is?
Well, you need your lapel mics, and I would say at a minimum you need 2 lapel mics, and if possible 3 and even 4, because lapel mics are notoriously finicky, and sometimes they just won't work, or they won't connect, or they rustle, or there's something going on with them. So if you've got one in backup, always highly recommend it.
Sound purists don't love lapel mics, but they are useful. They're useful in documentary because you can stick it on someone and get some pretty passable audio. Ideally, you're not relying only on that audio, so you've also got some sort of more directional shotgun mic, ideally operated, that's also giving you a backup but also richer sound. So I'd say that should be in the kit. And often your sound designers will ask for some stereo audio as well on location, which is the sort of the Atmos, and particularly helpful if you're doing a 5.1 surround sound mix. So you can see already there's a number of microphones there, and you need to understand what each one does, if they have buttons on them that are doing, high or low frequency cut, how the lapel microphones are pairing and interacting with each other and other frequencies, how your mixer or your Atmos microphone works. All of these things need to become really second nature for you, so that when you get on location, you're able to throw them up quickly and get really decent passable sound, and ideally really great sound.
Yeah, and what's really common for us is that we record the sound directly into the camera, where you have in the past used Zoom devices that, the audio is captured completely separate to the camera, and then we sync it in post-production. So again, it comes down to the equipment that you're using, and do you have a camera person who's also your soundie, or do you have a separate sound operator who can have their completely separate sound kit? It depends on the makeup of your crew and the gear that you're using, but there are different options for all of these things.
Yeah, and no matter how minimalist or expansive you're getting, you just need to understand what you've got in the kit, how it works, and always have a redundancy so you're not relying on a single sound source. And I think that leads us into cameras. Like, I am a big fan of multi-camera shoots because things can easily go wrong with cameras. And having a multi-camera shoot, at least 2 cameras on, it really helps you in your editing and how you can put the story together in post, but it also gives you that all-important redundancy if something goes wrong with one of your cameras. Where possible, I'd also suggest breaking out at least one backup camera into a separate bag, so that if something goes missing, you've got a backup, somewhere in your kit as well.
I'd hate for a camera to go missing. Touch wood, hasn't happened to us yet, but I guess anything's possible.
I've been in situations where I've needed to rely on a camera, even a small one that I've had in my backpack, just as a backup, and a microphone in there as well. So I think when it's really critical that you get a particular scene on a particular day, that you always have redundancies and backups there.
Yeah, likewise with batteries and spare batteries, and just making sure everything's charged before your shoot so that things don't go flat, and with your cards, making sure that they're all available and that you're not worrying on set that you're recording over the last shoot because you haven't backed it up properly, or all of those kinds of things. You just want to make sure that you're really organised with having backups for everything.
Okay, so we're talking about cameras. I think we need to talk about tripods as part of this as well. So we need to have tripods that are really quick and easy to use as documentary filmmakers, so that we're not lugging around things that are too heavy or too clunky to reset all the time. So I really favour the lightest weight fluid head tripods I can find, and ideally, made from carbon fibre and with telescopic legs, because it just lets me set a camera into the right height balanced and safe, with the least amount of time. So I think this is something that is really useful. But again, tripods, they have a lot of features on them. So you need to spend a bit of time getting to know your tripods and how they actually work.
Yeah, and if you are travelling a lot with your gear, you don't want heavy tripods if you can avoid it, or you might want one heavy tripod for the main camera, but then the rest of them, keep them as light as you can, because tripod bags get so heavy to lug around.
They do, and you've got all the luggage limits, so if it's going to be over 23 kilos, then you're going to be paying excess luggage all the time. So it's another reason to pack as light as possible with the best, most functional gear you can get. And that brings us to lights. I think lights are one of the hardest things to manage on documentary crews. They add a lot of value, but a lot of lights are so big, bulky, and heavy, so we can't actually travel with these big bulky lights that maybe we'd love to get the best lighting effects. So how do you get around that?
Well, we've got some very light lights in our kit that have batteries, so that they don't need to be plugged into the wall, but they do also have the option for being plugged into the wall. They're small and versatile, but they don't have a huge amount of power in them, so they're not necessarily the best for studio kind of setups.
Yeah, that's right. So for really dark environments, they're not ideal. But often in documentary, we're using natural light as one of our sources, and we're working with that natural light and adding to it, which is great because you can start bringing in things like LED lights that are battery operated, that are much lighter weight, lower profile, that you can move around easily from shoot to shoot.
So what about testing your gear? Mike, how do you go about testing all the various different bits and pieces in a kit?
I think there are two parts to this, and I just want to jump forward to production just for a moment. I cannot tell you how many times we have been saved by the discipline of watching rushes every single day. And not every filmmaker does this, and you hear these horror stories about when they get back from a shoot and then bring the material into the edit suite and realise that they were missing a sound source, or one of the cameras wasn't functioning as it should have. So it is absolutely critical that you keep watching all of your material and listening to it every single day when you're on location. But before that comes pre-production, and the same principle applies. I think you need to make sure that with all of the gear you're using, that you are recording it and that you're bringing it into your edit suite to have a look at it and have a listen to it, because there's a lot you will discover that you won't see in camera or while you're recording the audio out on location. So this is another critical part of the testing process.
And it helps you develop problem solving. If you've come across the problem when you've been testing it in studio with your team, then when you're out on location, you kind of already know what the problem is and you can possibly fix it really quickly. Yeah,
and I think you can start, putting some fences around the type of production you're doing, often in terms of what some of the key camera settings are, what your go-to, ISO is, for example, what, type of exposure you're going for. Some of the, the camera presets, in terms of color presets, can be really important, making sure that different cameras in your collection are shooting in a way that's complementary. Same goes for audio, what audio level we're recording to. And you can avoid a lot of pitfalls that can come when you're on production just by going through that process and thinking it through in advance. So highly recommend doing that type of testing before you get out in the field. So we've touched on the importance of why testing your gear ahead of the shoot in pre-production is so absolutely critical to the success of your shoot, making sure it rolls out smoothly and on budget. So hopefully you found that helpful. Sue, what should these guys do if they want to find out more?
I just head over to the Moonshine Communications Academy website, where we have a resources section. There's all kinds of info in there, and you can certainly go through all the different episodes that we're producing in this series on how to produce a documentary film. And we've covered everything up until, we're getting close to the end of pre-production now, and then we're going to be moving into production over the coming episodes.